Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to this episode of Sharia Intelligence. In the last couple of series, we have been looking at the Islamic legal maxims or Islamic legal philosophy, Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah, and today we are looking at the last of those maxims. I am your host, Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss today's episode are two of our distinguished facilitators, volunteers with the Dawah Institute and trainers in this course, Sharia Intelligence, Brother Nasir Bello and Ibrahim Bello. You are both most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I'd like to start with Malam Ibrahim with the maxim that we want to look at today, Al-Ada Muhakkama, usually translated as custom of a people takes the weight of law or has the weight of law in Islamic jurisprudence or in Islam as a whole. What more can you tell us about the meaning and the implication of this maxim, and what is it trying to promote or protect?
Al-Ada just means the good side of cultural norms and practice of people that Islam has approved of, does not clash with the maqasid or the goal of Islam. It is that aspect of their lives that they live on. It's become part of them, and often it always tallies with a common sense or sound human reasoning. They are meant for the well-being of the community, for those who understand it. Usually, if you're in that community and for the first time you seem to like it's strange, if you get somebody and they explain to you, you say, okay, this is what it is meant to serve. Now, already, like we say, Islam already has cleared whatever is not in line with the maqasid. So when we're discussing of Ada now as having the weight of law, we're talking of those ones that are approved of by Islam. Those that do not clash with the maqasid of Islam.
So approved of here means it doesn't clash.
It doesn't clash.
Not that there's a verse of the Quran or
No, it doesn't clash, of course.
Good.
Because it's not, you just cannot get Islam approving one after the other, but they don't clash with the basic intents and higher intents of Sharia. Now, these things are very intricate because they are very vital in how people think. Cultures or other customs are very powerful in the sense that they affect our perspectives. The way we judge things usually is coming from our cultural or customary background. Our understanding, our interpretation, including linguistic and usages of things. Now, what did Prophet ﷺ did when he came? His own approach to these norms is not that of condemnation, but to just give it what you can call a sort of, Islam will just adopt whatever does not contradict its own tenets, as simple as that. And so Islam adopts many. The prophets, like his own approach was to leave things the way they are from that cultural perspective, except those that clearly contradict the teachings of Islam, mostly on Aqidah and Ibadah related things. But it's not just adopt per se, but to give it the weight of law. Okay? To take it as part of. So the Prophet will say, "Innama bu'ithu li'utammima makarim al-akhlaq." I was sent to come and perfect, good virtues. So which means what was already fine, Islam is okay. And we can see this from a number of things the Prophet ﷺ did. Most of the things we see in Islam, including these tools of Islamic finance, mudaraba, musharaka, they are part of it. Jizya, polygyny or polygamy, the terms and conditions of war, a number of all those things, Islam actually approve of. Because people are different, and in fact, when we go deeper, we see that variation or changes in customs is actually among the wisdoms of Allah. Because when he said, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ. Meaning, you differ in your skin color and your tribes and languages. It goes in line to say, even in your dressing, in your culture, in your architecture. So Islam is not a religion that has its own unique custom. No. It adopts all good side of every custom, but only have issue with those of them that are in contradiction with the basic teachings of Islam. And so Islam gives this thing a very powerful acceptance. Islam look at cultural norms or customs as another important tool of assessing issues, of viewing issues. And from the Sharia perspective, like we say, the Prophet ﷺ was also respectful of other people's cultural norms, and that we can actually take wisdom from them. So this issue of Islam adopts not just his own, but he respects others and was not hesitant in looking at how do other people do it. To tell you how important cultural norms and practices can be. Because this is what people have lived long, ages. They've been fine with it. If they've become like their unwritten constitution, it means there are wisdom in it. And it's for their own well-being and common good. So from the religious perspective and the Prophet's attitude to customs and cultures of other people, we can actually learn from them. We can actually take from them also.
This reminds one of the principle of istishab, of legal presumption, that everything is halal except what is haram. And when it comes to custom and people's cultures, as you are saying, the default from the time of the Prophet was all cultural practices of all people were halal by default. And it's only if they conflict with the Quran and Sunnah that we have a problem. And what the Prophet usually did, as you've mentioned, polygamy was not introduced by Islam, but restricted. Certain aspects of it prohibited, certain aspects of it introduced, but modified to ensure that it didn't conflict with the Quran and Sunnah and Maqasid.
Yeah, and from different, just to add, this kind of things, for us to get it clear, we look at the facets or indices of cultural norms. Names, for instance, dress, for instance, the architecture, the kind of food. Like none of these the Prophet ﷺ changed in the Arabia, except for specific reasons. Umar was Umar. The dressing he made Arabs wearing, he adopted it. The delicacy, the variety of food, the way they design their houses, like everything about, because culture is the totality of people's way of living. So you cannot just come and start saying, because I'm bringing a new religion, that you should change your way of life. It's going to be difficult. And so this is it.
Thank you very much. Malam Nasir, what would you add?
I think a very important metaphor by Sheikh Umar Farooq Abdullah in trying to describe this idea of culture and the implication or the meaning of this very important maxim of Al-Ada Muhakkama is that metaphor of a flowing water in a stream, which is colorless, and it reflects the background of the color of it reflects the color of the background of the environment. Therefore, if the background is red, it appears reddish. If it is brown, it appears a brown color. It's a very important description of this very important maxim. But then there are some issues or challenges that you usually find in the dynamics of things. The challenge of using da'wah by usually the majority Muslim majority ethnic group. Da'wah tend to appear as a tool for cultural apostasy, cultural imperialism, and undermining, tool for undermining minority, good customary practices of the minority. Usually, if you look at our societies, it's very common with Arabs, Hausas, Swahilis in Africa, Pakistanis, the majority, Muslim majority community, their culture tend to dominate and appear in such a way that you hardly segregate it with the real teachings of Islam, and it appears to particularly people that are from minority culture that Islam is adopting the culture of this majority, and of course living all the things that you are known with, these your norms. So this, I think, is a big issue in the discourse around this very important maxim. And again, another important issue that help in understanding how Islam engage cultures is when an unhealthy culture or custom is identified, the need for caution and adoption of strategy and being gradual, particularly when it becomes necessary and important to alter it or to change it. And this is something that is very typical of the Quran. Usually certain attitudes or behaviors over time become part and parcel of certain culture, I mean the custom or the norm of the way the people run their life, because essentially culture is the way of life of people. If you look at how Quran approach certain issues that have become so ingrained, so part and parcel of the culture of Arabs, that idea of gradualism. If you look at the case of alcohol, for example, how the Quran followed different stages, that gradual approach in trying to disabuse the mind and discourage the Arabs and Muslims at that time regarding this issue of alcohol. And again, you would find lots of verses of the Quran and hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam still under the discourse around this, understanding the scope and implication of this very important maxim that map out the dynamics in the relationship between Muslims and others, where you see hadith like man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. Blind imitation, whoever imitates people blindly is with them, is just like them. It has a lot of implication, and Rasulullah here is really admonishing us that we should be careful, we shouldn't imitate other people blindly. Many ahadith that speaks to the prohibition. So basically, blind imitation, Islam is against the idea of blind imitation. There are hadith that speaks to the prohibition of imitating the religious symbol, religious practice of other people. So this is another important thing that we need to understand while engaging these issues of culture and cultural practice. Where is the boundary? Another important prophetic hadith is this issue of Khaliful Yahuda wa Nasara. Try to distinguish, to differentiate yourself with the Jews and Christians. And this is specifically referring to some of the religious identical markers, some of the very important things that symbolically present or differentiate a Muslim with others. It does not necessarily have any problem with engaging with one another on areas of similarities. So issues of mere resemblance, issues that have to do with culture, trying to copy certain cultural attitudes or behaviors of certain people, you would find Islam not having any problem with that. In fact, Rasulullah on many occasions accepted gifts by people of other culture, and you will see him wearing even clothes that comes to them from them. In fact, in certain instances, you would find Rasulullah even encouraging learning certain things that are useful from other cultures. For example, you would find this idea of al-hikmatu dhallatul mu'min, the values, the behaviors, the conduct that emanate from other cultures could be a very useful wisdom. And that is why even prisoners of war, some of the things that Rasulullah do with them is for them to teach children of Muslim some of the things that are useful that and this is something that is tied to their culture, and this will be what they will present to free themselves. You will also find so basically in a nutshell, Islam is not in any way against adoption or accepting or trying to, is open to cultures, like I said at the beginning, using the metaphor of Sheikh Umar Farooq Abdullah. is open and accommodative to all cultures, and it's against cultural apostasy. It discourages people relinquishing their cultural identity and values in the name of Islam, and that speaks to the very point I mentioned at the beginning. This idea of depreciating what is for a minority culture. What is this? Is it in this Islam that I am now trying to study and understand that is Arabic culture of the Arabs, or the culture of the Hausas if it is in Nigeria, or the culture of the Swahilis being the dominant population of Muslims? And what is it that is the main teaching of Islam that I can accommodate and adopt and use the good cultural norms in my own culture and carry on? So Islam is all about ethics in culture, trying to bring in ethics and good values in culture, and therefore it just filters some things that are not good, are not in line, and brings harm and creates a problem, are not in line with the spirit, or what we call the maqasid of Sharia, and that's it. And again, you would find that what Islam encourages as the default mindset for a Muslim is this open-mindedness, this attitude of accommodating, this attitude of trying to see your own culture, your own local culture as part and parcel of Islam. And therefore, that is why it doesn't make sense. It's an oxymoron for you to say an Islamic culture. Any culture can be Islamic so long as it is ethical, so long as it is respecting the principles of Islam, so long as it's in line with the objectives of Islam, it can be Islamic. So in reality, there is no any specific culture that can be tagged as an Islamic culture. Allah knows best.
Or un-Islamic.
Exactly, or un-Islamic culture.
Because this is a very, very, very interesting understanding. That this maxim al-ada muhakkama, it's not saying Arab ada muhakkama. It's all customs, all cultures have the weight of law as their default hukum. They are to be followed, they are to be respected by their own people only if they conflict or contradict. And the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was to even look at Jahiliyyah community not as a kufr community. And very important, I think some scholars try to point out, the Prophet actually, the idea of Jahiliyyah was just ignorance about Allah. It wasn't that they were all bad people. And so the Prophet would even talk about Khairukum fil Jahiliyyah, Khairukum fil Islam. Those who are good in Jahiliyyah, you even become better when they become Muslims. The recognition of goodness in cultures and customs that may not be knowledgeable about God, but it doesn't mean the human fitra in them, the reasoning, the practices have not produced anything good in those communities. I think it's even good to remember that every community has had prophets sent to them in their past, that there are some of their practices that actually may have originated from some form of divine wisdom that we may not be aware of. And the positive position Islam takes to not treat things that are new as automatically un-Islamic, that every culture is Islamically acceptable except what conflicts with the Quran, with the Sunnah, the letter and spirit of the law. And I
think that is why you would find all form of contracts that don't have anything that demonstrate harm or injustice in them that exist before Islam. And before Islam, I mean before, during the time of the Prophet and even now, are all recognized and accepted, including marriage. You don't have to, for example, a family don't need to renew their marriage vows and contract another new marriage just because they've accepted Islam, because Islam has no problem with that arrangement. It has no problem with that arrangement. And if you look at this case of Hilful Fudul, where Rasulullah ﷺ was a party to something that is good, sort of a civil society arrangement before Islam,
during the Jahiliyyah period.
During the Jahiliyyah period.
Yes.
And you will hear that Rasulullah ﷺ, even much later, after the coming of Islam, appreciating that good initiative, and even saying that if something like that will be initiated even now, I will join. So that I think is a very important point to remember, that Islam is not about condemning or disrespecting all the good cultural norms that exist before Islam, or even that is before Islam for individual or for a society. It has such of a filter where it is. That is why I think, like I said at the beginning, this idea of ethics,
Yes.
respecting ethical values, looking at the objectives of Sharia as a filter of accepting or measuring what is right and what should be allowed and endorsed and what should be filtered, is the most important thing.
This is really interesting. The default halalness, and not just even permissible, but has the weight of law, the endorsement Islam gives cultures, because the tendency for many people is to say, this is Western culture, as if that is un-Islamic by default, or this is our native local culture, as if there's anything wrong with it by default. What we're hearing is the sunnah of the Prophet was to treat cultures as halal by default unless they conflicted with the Quran and the Sunnah. But at the same time, I think this issue of being proud of your own cultural identity and not blindly following others, but as you've also mentioned, not copying others in those aspects of their culture that are actually tied to Aqidah or belief that is contrary to Islamic teachings. I'd like to move on to this issue of the evidence for these maxims. We've said the Prophet endorsed, this is what the Sunnah is. Do we have anything from the Quran or from the Sunnah that gives greater justification and authority to this maxim, al-ada muhakkama, custom has the weight of law?
Of course, you will find verses in the Quran, particularly this verse in the Quran that talks about keeping forgiveness and enjoining people with good norms, and being shying away from the ignorant. خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. This, I think, is this part where it talks about وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ. The good norms, you should enjoin people to respect and to adopt the good norms. If you look at the case of the wife of Abu Sufyan, one of the companions of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whose wife complained to Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam that her husband is not giving her enough money to take care of the family, and it's not as if he doesn't have the money. He is sort of a miserly person, and Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam ordered her to pick from his wealth, from his money, that which by ada, by the urf of that particular community is enough to handle that particular thing, or that is affairs of her family, that things that she feels he is not giving her enough. So that referral of what is enough in the ada is a pointer to how Rasulullah regulate things and respect the use of cultural norms in issuing fatwa or in trying to guide society.
So instead of the Quran or Sunnah saying this is the quantity,
exactly,
the Prophet ﷺ or the Sunnah is actually saying let custom dictate what that measure is.
Exactly. And you find that if you look at the case of Haida, for example, also you find things like that. I think is it the hadith of Fatima bint Jahash, where she complained to Rasulullah that her bleeding is not stopping. So this is not just an ordinary Haida. How will she stop praying throughout the bleeding period? And then Rasulullah said to her, the issue with your own haida now is it is sickness, and what you should do is you estimate the number of days that is peculiar to your community. That is what is the norm in terms of the number of days that majority of women observe their own haida. For example, if it is common, what becomes the norm in this particular society is 5 days. Then take the 5 days and assume it is your own haida, after talking about what to differentiate, particularly if it's difficult to differentiate that of the disease and the sickness and that of the menstrual period. He said you should base it on the urf of your people. So this is also acknowledging the relevance of custom in trying to come up with laws. You would find lots of examples in the Sunnah of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam around this kind of things. Another important reason is that statement that was actually associated or reported by Ibn Mas'ud, where he said, whatever Muslims see as good, it is also good in the eyes of Allah. And if you look at the life of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, particularly on issues around war strategy or military strategy, you would find him adopting lots of cultural strategies that comes from even other people. Is it the issue of digging trenches during the Battle of Khandak, the idea that came from a great companion, Salman al-Farisi, for example, or the idea of building a catapult that is used in a battle.
Which came from Persian culture,
of course,
military
yes,
culture.
Which came from Persian military culture. So these are things that are known. These are things that are the usual things during the time of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
So it would be wrong for somebody to say the culture of non-Muslims is haram. One would say the culture of everybody, non-Muslims, is halal by default, unless that particular aspect of a culture conflicts with the Quran and Sunnah. And an interesting point you're making is when we look at the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, Sunnah is what the Prophet said, his tradition, what he said, what he did, what he approved of. But among the things he approved of were things that were done by others that were predominantly customary things, which found their way into the Sunnah as those things that were accepted as Sunnah of the Prophet, which ties into some of those things that we discussed earlier, Ibn Ashur's classification of the Sunnah so as to distinguish what is Tashri, we must follow, and what are those things that were done but not considered binding. As you've mentioned, certain particular types of dress, the kind of material they use, the architecture of their houses, while these were all approved of as cultural norms, other alternative cultural norms are also accepted. Malam Ibrahim, what would you add to the justification? Any examples that give authority to the maxim al-ada muhakkama?
No. Yeah, most of the time, wherever Allah uses ma'aruf in Quran, it's referring to what is customarily known or acceptable. So there's a verse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was cautioning those in charge of the property or wealth of the orphan. He said, وَمَنْ كَانَ غَنِيًّا فَلْيَسْتَعْفِفْ وَمَنْ كَانَ فَقِيرًا فَلْيَأْكُلْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, and a number of verses like that. Now for those that will be in charge of the wealth of an orphan, whosoever among them is well off, then he should desist from, فَلْيَسْتَعْفِفْ, meaning you can accommodate feeding him from your own. وَمَنْ كَانَ فَقِيرًا, he said, فَلْيَأْكُلْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Ma'ruf here means what is customary norm, is a standard, known. So that's why wherever Allah uses ma'ruf in Quran is actually referring to urf, yani how it is done.
Good customs.
Yeah. Now, a number of things the Prophet ﷺ did, he actually adopted them, either from the existing Arab culture or from other cultures during his time. Number one, you see this shaking hands was not part of the culture of the Arabs in the Mecca. It was imported really from Yemen. Islam adopted it. You have issues like jizya, this military tax.
Military exemption.
Military exemption tax. You have this concept of zimma, citizen under Islamic State that are given protection. You have issues like polygamy. It was actually there, the Prophet only modified it. You have things like this issue of azl, coitus interruptus, and gila, that the Prophet ﷺ even had to look into the Persian and other cultures, the Europeans now, like, how do they do it? And it was fine. And he used that to stamp it, to give it the weight of Shariah, and say, carry on, you can do. And you see a great Sahabi like Amr bin al-As praising the Romans because of some traits, like some 5 things he mentioned about the Romans that he said they are worth emulating, words of wisdom. He said, number 1, they are the most forbearing in time of calamity. They are the most enduring. They're the most of calamity. They are the most, they could forgive fast when they have issues with their rivals. They used to be the first to renew attack. They are best at checking the excesses of their leader, and they are the most generous and kind to their orphans, the weak and the poor. And see a Sahabi of the Prophet, but could actually see good in the opposition of this nature. So when we look at how Islam, the Prophet ﷺ actually look at cultural norms and customs, whatever you call it. Islam can best be described as what you can call, like Sheikh Umar Farooq Abdullah will call it supra-cultural. Supra meaning like it covers all. As it flows over various cultures, it adopts and only filter some trash. And so that is what gives Islam that uniqueness. Wherever you have, you see, the basic tenets of Islam are nobody changes prayer, nobody changes fasting, what have you. But those things to do with their norms and ways of doing things, their ways of celebrating, okay, all of these things is customized to their culture. And Islam has no problem with that.
This is very interesting. The fact that, as you've mentioned in the hadith, I think from Sahih Muslim, about the Prophet talking about the end of times and how the Romans would dominate, which was understood by scholars to be a reference to Europeans or the Byzantines at that time. And these 5 qualities, and the fact that Amr bin al-As was an Arab, but could say good about another culture, and he was well-traveled in those days. He was a well-known diplomat, somebody who studied other cultures and people, and mentioning these traits, they were the quick, you said, to recover from an attack, to recover from calamity. They are the most helpful to their poor and orphans, etc. But an interesting one, they were the best at checking the excesses and oppression of their kings and leaders. And the fact that Amr bin al-As radiallahu anhu recognized that as a good thing in other cultures, that may be the reasons why they would dominate towards the end of times. And I think the fact that the Prophet ﷺ would hear an idea that was useful, like digging a trench as a military strategy, he didn't say, but it was a non-Muslim culture and therefore it is haram, but to look at what was good. And probably that verse of the Quran where Allah, after saying how He has created us, shu'uban wa qaba'il lita'arafu, He has created us into nations and tribes that we get to know each other. Ta'arafu, is reciprocal. You learn about others as others learn about you. And the wisdom in getting what is good from others without just blindly following, of course. I'd like to move on to the subject of the authority of this maxim. You've given a lot of explanations. You've actually brought quite a number of verses of the Quran, Hadith. But how, in some of the other maxims, we've discussed how some of these maxims have children. Some of these maxims have other sub-maxims under them that help us actually appreciate. They more or less give greater appreciation to the broad implications of this maxim, al-ada muhakkama. What are some of the other sub-maxims that are related to this maxim?
Now, okay. Number 1, you say al-aslu fil ada al-ibaha. That the norm, the premise with cultural norms and practices is permissibility, except otherwise exempted from a Sharia point of view. Number 2, al-aslu fil ada al-afu. Okay, that the norm is that cultural norms are not blamed. They're okay as long as you don't have anything. Even if you detest it because of your background, as long as it doesn't contradict anything clearly from Sharia. And like I say, often most of the cultural aspects that have problem with Sharia are clear. Very often with superstition, beliefs, worship, indecency, immorality, vulgarity, all those kind of excess things, that even sound, so somebody would sound reasoning like these ugly men. Aside that, Islam is fine. Also, you used to say that al-ma'arufu urfan kal-mashrutu shartan. That whatever is known from the custom is also known like a condition. Like if something is ingrained in people like an unwritten constitution, now it's like a condition in Sharia. And also that you don't give attention to literal meaning of words when it actually has cultural implication. So this goes far as saying that expressions and cultural gestures all have the weight of law, and they will be considered as such. So you don't go and say, but this is the meaning, this is the one. No, no, no. As an expression, what does it mean? So these are all the maxims that emanate from that al-ada muhakkama. And that's why in our contemporary reality, you go to each culture, village, particularly those dealing in properties, farmers, they have these kind of unwritten constitutions that everybody knows, and that is it. Islam is okay with it, and when Islam goes there, it adopts it. Yeah.
Well, Nasir, how many other maxims can you share that are like sub-maxims of these?
Well, I think Mala Ibrahim has really mentioned a lot of them. Some of the other maxims that I can remember, this maxim that says matters recognized by merchants is treated as an obligation, as a contractual obligation between them or amongst them. And another important maxim is actually around this issue of change in times require change in laws. There is this concept, and you would find culture playing a significant role in the dynamics of society, in the changes that happen through time. This idea of cultural shock, where you would find a society having their laws or the way of life, particularly on issues around transaction, becoming completely alien to the ways they live, to the new culture that evolve over time, and therefore that necessitate formulation of laws that fit into the existing or the new emerging culture. And that is much appreciated when we begin to see culture beyond geography, when we begin to see culture from the perspective of history, how cultures are becoming so dynamic, how societies are evolving, and gradually their culture also and their norms are evolving completely different from what it used to be, and how that is significant, is really required to play into the way they formulate their laws, in the way they issue their own fatwa. And that is why you will find even in the issue of fatwa disposition of scholars, certain scholars will keep arguing that what you have as jurisprudence in the past is becoming a history of jurisprudence. We need scholars because of the cultural shift that usually happen in societies to come up with new fiqh that will reflect their realities. And that is actually what I think quite significant in the intersection of this particular maxim of change in time requires change in laws with the cultural or the principle or the maxim of al-ada muhakkama.
This is, I think, very important also when it comes to the relationship between this maxim in Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya and in Usul al-Fiqh, in the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, where for some madhabs, urf is a source of law. And as you've mentioned, Malam Ibrahim, that where the Quran and Sunnah are silent on an issue, the maxims of al-asl is that, and if we look at these istishab maxims, they are established by Quran and Sunnah. And so the new norm that Sharia accepts is what people accept, so long as it doesn't conflict. The area I'd like to look at a bit more, Malam Nasir, is examples of the application of this maxim to real life. What are some examples of positions scholars have taken when it comes to the implementation of this maxim al-ada muhakkama?
What you find is normally, if cultural law or punishment is in line, and in any culture you can think about, or any custom, any society, is not contradicting the letter, a clear text of Quran and Sunnah, or the spirit, that is the maqasid, is accommodated and given the weight of the law. It's accepted as part and parcel of Islamic law in that particular society. So it's a very general and open-ended provision or arrangement regarding application of laws and punishments. And that goes into even the scope of what we call ta'azir, for example. In even punishment, there are lots of accommodations in cultural practices around that particular area or domain in our laws and of course justice system.
Ta'zir referring to the punishments that are left to the discretion of the judge.
To the discretion of the judge. So you would find a lot of cultural norms coming into this kind of discretions, because the judge is a product of his own society, and acceptability of certain kind of judgments really fit into what seems to be the norm in the society. Another important area of application is how Sharia accommodate or accept the cultural idiomatic expressions and their implications. If somebody said, I killed 2 birds with 1 stone, the interpretation, cultural interpretation of what that is, not the literal interpretation, is what is actually considered, even in the court, for example. Or for example, somebody will say he shot himself on the foot, or somebody said, I am dead, for example, and many other examples of this kind of expressions that you will often find in different cultures and different societies. Another very important area of application is the jargons that are actually common with professions. For example, in organizations or in management, it's common for a boss to say to his employee, you are fired. And by saying you are fired, that means we no longer need your services.
It's got nothing to do with fire.
Exactly. It doesn't have nothing to do with fire. So that understanding that is given or tied to that jargon, if for example now later the boss decided to change his mind and then said, okay, I didn't mean you should leave your job, I mean you are fired, I'm just, and the guy that is fired, or the guy that assumed he lost his job, insisted that I am not coming back, and for example the boss decided to take him to court. I said you are fired to him and he stopped coming to work, and I insisted that he should he come back to work, and he said you already terminated my appointment with you. The judge will of course accept and tilt to the side of the employee, because his interpretation is what seems to be the normal acceptable jargon in the profession. For example, you say Black Friday in accounting, for example, is another jargon that is interpreted and understood. It has nothing to do with the black color. In fact, it's something good. When in certain other fields and other societies, black is associated to something that is bad, something that is not good. In accounting, if they say Black Friday, they mean something that is profitable. They are talking about profit, something that will make every other person there to smile. So there are this kind of jargons that you'll find in different professions that usually they are accorded their meaning in that particular culture or custom, not actually the literal meaning. Again, you would find Islam adopting many administrative leadership procedures that are actually in any way not originated by Islam. They are, a product of different cultures. Just because they are mechanisms or they are vehicles that help in achieving different objectives of Sharia. So Islam just accommodate them and work with them. And there are many other examples you will find around this kind of things.
It's interesting how you mention administrative systems, political systems that were already there on the ground. And we find even after the conquest of Makkah, the Prophet, Abu Sufyan had accepted Islam. The Prophet didn't change the administrative structure of the society. It was already accepted, and everything accepted except what is prohibited. Looking at more examples, Malam Ibrahim, what others can you give when it comes to Al-Ada Muhakkama?
Al-Ada Muhakkama has a deeper application, and the applications are not just static, but as the society transforms. Okay? The Ada Muhakkama also application transform. So Islam endorses all new financial tools that come on board, as long as they don't contradict any of the existing tenets. Or you go to a community, their way of transaction that has been in existence long before they even know Islam, Islam adopts it. Also, what constitutes the dress of a man or a woman is dictated by culture, and Islam is fine with it. So when the Prophet will condemn men that dress like women, not only in Arabia, also in your culture. So also, these festivals, anniversaries, commemorations in various cultures and tribes that are actually not attached to their religious belief. They are not product of religious dictate. They are on their own, that is how they are. Then Islam has no problem with it. Usually this issue of debate come on every now and then. But the question has always been, the key point has always been, as long as it is not religious, then nothing make festivals haram except what is done in them. But as a rule, festivals are muamalat. In fact, part of cultures, and Islam has no problem with them. Of course, Islam has problem with some other side of cultural practices, like erotic dancing of men and women, like premarital cohabitation. We have cultures where, unmarried ladies have to go naked one day in a year. They have a night that all ladies in that community as a proof of virginity. So all of these ones are haram. Sometimes they expect if a lady marry for the first time, she had intimacy with her husband, they will expect a blood stain as a proof of her virginity. Subhanallah, all of these things are not religious. Or where people will bury their daughters alive, or cultures where people will cut some part of a live animal to extract blood. Some other cultures, they always believe that for any key decision like marriage or so, they need to go and see a soothsayer or somebody that will foresee the future. A number of these things, including forced marriages in some cultures. All of these things are not Islam. They are not the kind of cultures Islam is adopting or norms. Those with this, that Islam has a thick line of divide between what is indecent, what is unacceptable, and all other things that Islam has not, we have no evidence for. From textual basis of Islam, they remain permissible.
This is very, very useful, and one can think of many cultural gestures that show respect or disrespect. Somebody, lifts a finger, and in one culture, you're just lifting a finger. In another culture, that is the worst insult you can make to somebody's dignity and respect, and can be taken to court. And when it goes to court, you don't say, but there's nothing in the Quran or Sunnah that says, I can't lift a finger, or I can't make this gesture. Al-Ada will be muhakkama, that if in the custom it is considered a culture, then Sharia would consider it a culture. And as you've also mentioned, which is interesting, what is male dressing, what is female dressing? Because if men are prohibited from dressing like women, and women are prohibited from dressing like men, where a man, you should be proud of your own dressing, women, be proud of who you are, we find certain types of dressing as shared between men and women. So in some cultures, for example, the sarong or the wrapper is something that men wear and women wear. Back to the time of the Prophet would wear izar. Arab men would wear a wrapper. But I know for certain customs, that's like a man wearing a skirt. Here in northern Nigeria, no imam would be allowed to go and lead prayers if he's wearing a sarong and says, but it's in the sunnah. Al-ada muhakkama, because even the Prophet wore that because it was part of culture and custom, not prescribed sunnah that everybody had to also use. And I'd like to repeat the maxim you raised, and both of you, sorry, not the maxim, the metaphor that Sheikh Umar Farooq Abdullah Wayman Lingraf used on this topic, that Islam is like a river or like a stream, a very clean stream that flows and takes the color of the surrounding soil, of the surrounding rocks. You know, when you see it going over red, it looks red. When you see it going over something, it absorbs what is good in all other cultures. And so Islamic law by its nature cannot be uniform everywhere. By definition, Islamic law will have those thawabit, those fixed parts that are the same everywhere, but you will have a lot of areas in Islamic law where the law is silent, and Sharia would actually, based on public interest, based on maslaha, based on urf, people's customs, absorb and accommodate customary laws as Islamic laws. And I think the point you made earlier about cultural apostasy, where some people actually present Islam as if you are required to abandon your local names and your local dressing and your local everything, and adopt that of the major Muslim ethnic group. Whereas if you look more carefully, the local name of you in your culture is Islamically acceptable, the way Umar is acceptable. It wasn't invented by Islam. Most of the names of the Sahaba were names just customary names. People who embraced Islam were not required to change their names if there was nothing wrong. And so this issue of respecting cultural diversity and recognizing that we should be very careful not to let our method of spreading Islam end up also spreading our culture. That we, just because Islam is okay with this particular cultural practice of ours doesn't mean that is what Islam prescribes for other people who have alternative cultures. And so for people who, especially Muslim minorities, who have embraced Islam, to not look down upon their own cultures and they want to change the way they dress, they want to start wearing hats of a particular type, they want to start things that are very countercultural, but not necessarily counter-Islamic. So to be cautious about the predatory cultural nature of our own ethnic instinct and recognize al-ada muhakkama, that people's customs should be respected so long as they don't go contrary. And if we have to change a particular cultural practice, of course, depends on what it is, to recognize the sunnatic method of the Prophet's gradual changing of, say, alcohol or various things, slavery and things that were cultural norms, but Islam found gradual ways of trying to root these out of communities. I'd like to thank you both for your contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.